So my name is Andrew Verbancourt. I am a partner and CEO, head of design at Headway, and we work with a lot of companies to prototype and bring new products to market. So prototyping is a tool that we use to really gain confidence, gain traction, and really figure out, are we on the right track to build anything? So we'll dive more into that a little bit later.
Cool. And my name is Peter Romanesco. So I work with a company called TitletownTech. It's a local company here in Green Bay, Wisconsin, right where we are. So we invest in early stage companies, specifically check sizes around $100,000 to $1 million. And one of the things that we look for as we're looking at companies is how far have they gone through validating their customers, where's their business at, what's the size of the market, what problem are they solving. And so for us, prototyping is really important. Have two startups on my own. One's raised about $1.5 million, working through that right now. Prototyping was a key part of that. And then the other one's a bit smaller, more for fun. That one, prototyping was important as we found our own customers. So I've been through this before, and I'm now hoping that we can take our experiences, both Andrew and I, from separate perspectives, from the tech perspective and from the raising the capital perspective, and bring this together. So I think for tonight, this is kind of a quick what we're going to talk about. This is it's a short 120 slide presentation. So we're going to start with a fable. Andrew's going to tell a little story about his experiences. I'm going to talk a little bit about the art of the prototype, which is the name of this session, and what we think how art comes into play when you're creating something new that hasn't never existed before. We're going to go through the role of the early stage artist. So we're going to presume that each of you has the potential to be an early stage artist and what that means and what your responsibilities are to bring that idea into reality. We're going to talk about more tangibly the types of prototypes that exist, and this is less about, you may not see these terms in books, but it's Andrew and I have kind of come together and said we think these terms are about right when we think about prototypes. The value profiles of building right away versus prototyping, revisiting the role of the early stage artist, and then finally talking a little bit about what our tools of choice are. And then I came from doing some innovation work with corporates, so I'll also talk a little bit about the risks. I'm not sure how many people are here from a corporate setting and they're doing some work. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the role of prototyping in corporates and how that's a great benefit. At the same time, how there's some risk associated with that, because once you have a great idea in a corporate world, everyone wants you to move faster, and then they don't give you any resources. So it's like, oh, you just want me to move faster without resources? Okay, yeah, great. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah. Great, the cost to know. So Andrew, go ahead.
So just open up a little bit how we got into prototyping, customer development, that sort of thing. It was about 11 years ago. Actually, my brother and I and a partner of ours, we had a new idea for a business, a new idea for a product that we wanted to take to market. And we talked to some customers. In this case, it was establishments, bars, venues. We had some conversations, some light conversations around what we were trying to bring to market. They nodded their head a lot and said, yep, that sounds good. And what we did was we went and we said, hey, let's build this thing. So we spent about 8-9 months building the product that we thought they wanted based on a lot of assumptions that we didn't really vet. We didn't really show them any products, any prototypes, and realized that in the 9th month, we scheduled a kickoff event, essentially. Big celebration where we launched. We had hundreds of people there. We said, hey, we're actually doing this. This is going to be awesome. And we had a sign-up list, an email list, and that night, we went home. It was like 2 a.m., bar close, because it was actually a kind of a nightlife application. And went home. Next day, we had 2 people that actually responded to the email that signed up for accounts. We said, okay, yeah, maybe people are still kind of recovering from the night before. So we went on to actually wait a week, 2 weeks, and the same 2 people were the 2 at the end. And so we realized that all of the work we did actually in the basement in our makeshift office back in 2009 was kind of for waste, because we didn't really vet what people were saying and what they would actually do would come to life. And so really learned the hard lesson of pouring our lives, our nights, our weekends into that and realizing there's a better way. And so since then, have launched 5, 6 different startups of our own, some that have raised funding, millions of dollars, multiple series of rounds, some that have sold, and realized that there's a much better way to do it. And so now, actually with 2 of our partners that are here, we have Headway. We work with companies to really prototype new ideas, both startups and corporate innovation teams. And a big tool we use is prototyping. So I'm really excited to talk about this and open to give any advice, any questions that you have at the end. So
great. So we talk about the art of the prototype. I want us to sit in kind of two different spots tonight. So the first spot I want us to sit in is the spot of the artist. And it's kind of a wacky way to think about it, but at the end of the day, most of the time, what we're doing with innovation is we're finding a way to bring an idea that doesn't exist in reality, and we're trying to bring it to life. And you really do that through one of two ways. One, you change the way the atoms work in the world, and you're physically creating something from a manufacturing standpoint. So that could be like, before the iPhone exists, you're prototyping a phone out of wood, and you're testing to see if the home button is the right size for someone's finger, and you're carrying it around in your pocket, it's prototyping that stage. Or you're doing it digitally, so you're combining the zeros and ones to come up with a new way of maybe doing something 10 times more effective in your company and cutting costs significantly, but maybe there's not revenue attached, but still pretty groundbreaking. So tonight we're gonna focus specifically on the digital side, but I think what's important is that a lot of the principles will work and can be carried over to the more physical space, but that discussion really is a whole nother world of how do you handle resourcing and how do you handle type of equipment and all those types of things. So I think principally there's some similarities, but tonight we're gonna focus on the digital front. When we talk about the two terms and the art of the prototype, something that's really interesting is you look at how art is defined. It's defined as an output of a creative process that's typically done in a visual fashion. When we talk about prototyping, for those that have already done it, you know that often prototyping is just getting something down on paper, right? Getting it out of your mind and getting it on paper. And so a lot of ways, if you think about what art does for people, it's a way for you to tell a story without having to use your words. So you can leverage the power of images to help you can lean on a little bit to help get your point across. Someone can see this image so you can tell a more effective story. It fills the gaps for you. That's often what we're doing with prototyping. Instead of me telling you about my application, which is used Snapcat, which is used to take pictures of cats and share it with all your friends, I could show you a logo that's got a cat on it and you're like, oh, he's not kidding. It's actually Snapcat, right? So you can help kind of guide through that. We're going to talk about why that's important. The thing that we're going to continue to focus on and never ends is artistry. So this happens, this is an output. Art is the output, artistry is the input. The creative skill and ability that we use to take something from our mind or someone else's mind, if we're a designer, and getting it down on paper. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how do we combine our artistry with some practical tools and some responsibilities as someone who's typically in charge of their own business or their own idea, and how do we combine all these things together to get to success faster? And that's really the goal for tonight. And that's where we're taking the art of the prototype, which is a lifelong journey, and trying to shrink it down to an hour. So we'll see if we do it.
How many people have heard of design thinking before? So it's popularized by IDEO and many other companies, but really we're talking about the needs of the people, which is this product desirable? Is it needed? Success requirements, is this viable? And technical possibilities, is this feasible? So as we talk about these kind of three criteria for design thinking, it's about building a successful business, it's about being able to meet customers where they are, and then really, can we do this from a technical standpoint? And whether your prototype is software or hardware, you have certain limitations. So really trying to understand and dig into those, it's really important.
So one of the things that we're going to focus on in tonight's discussion for the most part, and Andrew and I shared this thought separately from our two different perspectives, is where do we think folks in this region that are coming out with new ideas, where can they focus on the most based on our experiences of interacting with these people? And what we decided on was it's not the technical possibilities. We aren't dreaming of things that are impossible, right? Time travel, everyone wants it. It's just an engineering problem, right? We're not talking about time travel here, right? When you talk about success requirements, we have some great kind of salt of the earth goals in the corporations and the startups that are being built here, really meaningful stuff, right? So it's not really the success requirements that cause this to fail. It's really, when you look at the needs of people, another way of saying this is how big is the problem? I think we have such a culture in a lot of ways of just focusing on getting the next thing done that it's difficult to let ourselves lean back and say, think bigger. And so the main thing for me that I see a lot is when I see startups in this region, it's always, have we thought big enough, right? There are a few where the success requirements are challenging or the technical possibilities are difficult. Those are there. I'm not saying they're not there. But for the most part, the majority will be, is this problem big enough? Can you prove it? Can you quantify it? And how do you do that? So tonight's all about trying to figure out, is this idea big enough? How can you prove if the idea is big enough? And that's a really important responsibility of both the artist and the prototype.
Yeah, one really important point I just want to mention too is the problem needs to be big enough. It needs to be understood by the people that have it. If you're doing a double sale where you're convincing someone they have a problem and you convince them that you have the solution, that's going to be a longer road. So we can use prototypes to realize, is this resonating with people? Are they understanding what we're putting forward as a value proposition? And can we test their behavior or their engagement moving forward through prototypes and other types of MVPs?
Okay, so now we get into the guts. So here we look at the role of the early stage artist, and I'm not sure if this is something that we can like get the presentation out to folks or something, but this here, when I look at these 8 goals, if you have an idea that's starting with nothing, it's in your head, my challenge to you is to get through at least 7 of these 8 goals, and we'll talk about which 7 they are later. And these are really difficult. It's really hard. The key thing, which Andrew talked about in his first launch, is that if you build, it's going to take you a long time. It's going to take a lot of sweat. It's going to take a lot of effort, potentially a lot of money, and sometimes it costs friendships. Because you often, when you're building something that's new, you're building it with your friends, right? And so for us, when I think of the role that we have as early stage artists, as I was thinking through, like, what's the definition of someone who's going to say, I want to bring this to life in earnest? It's really to the left. Your job is to deploy your creative skills and ability to both determine and then increase your chance of success. An early stage startup has a 1 out of 10 chance of succeeding, right? So out of all of us here, 4 of us will be successful. That's the reality, right? So the whole objective that everything you should be doing as an entrepreneur from that point forward is how do you manage risk to put the odds in your favor? And so how do you get creative, right? A lot of times creativity or innovation, they talk about moving forward with constraints in a unique fashion, right? So how do we take the constraints that we have and do something different? So with all of those things, the key areas, identifying a specific important problem we talked about, it's kind of area number 1. Identify and articulate your target market. How do you start to figure out what is your target market? Once you figure that out and you can get specific on it, start talking to people who know it, start doing some more research there. Defining your product requirements and design a solution. I know in my world, I have written so many requirements documents in, Excel, PowerPoint, Microsoft Word's my personal favorite. These are so many like super dense things. Imagine being able to have a demonstration that you could show a developer and say, hey, just make it do this. That covers like 60 to 70% of your job as a product owner if you're in the corporate world. So can you design something that articulates what they're looking for? A revenue model hypothesis, would you really be willing to pay for something? Testing the unit costs. If I want my prototype to do this, what's it gonna take? How much does that service cost? Do I really wanna go and build a chat application for this service that really already exists in 10 other ways? Could I just buy those and subscribe to those? Is there a free tier? You can start asking those questions on costs. You find your real potential customers. And then finally, the one I think is an important one we'll come back to is setting milestones for building your business. Once you have a prototype, you can start getting more realistic estimates for how long it's going to take. The one that's important at the end, identifying talent gaps, I'm putting that there because if you were going to go and ask for money, for example, usually what happens is the person at this stage is giving you personally money. I mean, you might have an LLC or a C Corp or something, but they're really betting on you. And so at this stage, it's important to understand that if this is going to be successful, you have to start moving beyond you. And that's why for a prototype, the tools we're going to talk about, they're not going to say, by the way, have you hired a CTO? They're not going to ask you those questions. But by putting things out of your mind onto paper or into these applications, it helps relieve some of the stress so you can start finding good talent. So we're going to come back to these things, but the main thing here, the deploying the creative skills and abilities to determine the chance of success and then increase it is really important. It's really important. It's going to be what makes the difference between someone who has everything going their way and fails for someone who has everything against them and succeeds. It's how do you manage that?
So one thing we're going to talk about is 3 different types of prototypes that you could test your idea, test your business model with. The first one being static, second one being functional, really the third one, a working prototype. Is what we're calling it, but it really could be a proof of concept, something that maybe the front end works, but the back end's not fully connected, something that's going to take a little bit more work than using some of these image-based tools. And so you can see here a couple of versions. There's Snapcat, one of the new ideas Peter's coming up with from TitletownTech here. You can chat with cats. So this is an example of a sketch. Obviously, this person is an artist, but really getting your ideas into a static prototype that you can sketch, that you can also determine and design out. What are some of the main features of the app? What are some of the value props? And then also really just going more high fidelity and being able to design out. These are all tools that you can use to talk with people, because we found that there's really 4 different conversations that happen. So when you're talking about your idea, there's what you said, there's what you thought you said, there's what they heard, and there's what they thought they heard. So every time we have a conversation with a person, we're creating a mental model in our head around, is this something familiar? Can I latch it to experience that I have or an existing application that I have? So all of these tools help us to kind of push that forward and make sure we're speaking the same language about the idea or the value prop. And then here's an example of a functional prototype, something that we'll talk a little bit more about, but you can see it's real. It feels real. If you had this on a phone, you'd be able to get this in front of a user, be able to, they would be able to interact. You'd be able to observe their behavior with it and how they would interact. You could also ask them questions about the types of messaging, understand where are the gaps, and really pick this apart. Might be known a little bit more as usability testing or some user research around what language you're actually using.
So what I would add here is, a lot of times when you're talking with people who care about you and would be the perfect customer, they won't give you feedback because they're talking to you, the person, and their friend or their niece or nephew or whomever. What this allows you to do, what a prototype allows you to do, especially a functional prototype, is you can ask very specific questions about the prototype that's in front of you. And then when they're answering, they're not answering to you. I mean, they're answering to you, but they're talking about the prototype. Do you like the way that when you click on that menu, it pops open? Or do you prefer it like this, where it slides open? Because here, and you can start with really low risk questions, and then you can get into high risk ones. Would you actually pay $16 to come and do this? Like, it's a great way where they're not really answering you, they're answering the prototype because you've put it in front of them. It's like you're sacrificing the prototype, which is a lot of work for you, but it's much easier to sacrifice that prototype than 6 months of building. It's a lot easier. And frankly, it's a lot easier for you to hear. Like running down and hearing that your baby is ugly after you have been coding this thing nights and weekends forever, you don't want to hear it. Like your first jump is, oh man, that person is wrong. But if you can spin something together in a couple of days, maybe a week, or maybe a dedicated weekend, and you can start all of a sudden hearing that didn't work, you're, oh yeah, well I think I can, what did you think about this? Or can I come back next week and I can show you something else? It's a much lower risk proposition. And often if you've got the right person, they get excited about it. They're like, wow, did you make this? That's what I hear all the time. Wow, did you make this? Like, yeah, I did. And here's why I'm making it. And you can tell that story, and you can just lean on the prototype to handle the hard and the complex conversations, because they'll look at it and you're both looking at the same thing. So that's, to me, the value of the functional prototype.
And then one that we mentioned as a type of prototype would be a working one. We don't have an example of that. We're not going to demo any software for you here, but something that you would build the front end for that you could potentially sell. And so as we talk about the Goldilocks zone of prototypes, it's something that you could get in front of people, that you could sell, that you could then manually do some of the business functions, the admin functions behind the scenes, but would be a working prototype that would be dynamic. It would bring personalized content to that user. There'd be some sort of login or access that they could have.
And for the record, everything that you're seeing in this presentation, so Andrew and I have either built or borrowed some of these things. We're going to go through all the tools that we built them with, so you'll be able to see and kind of walk away with 3 or 4 tools that have been used.
And so before we talk about this a little bit, I want to tell a story that I heard from Connor Neal. And he tells a story about a pottery class where the professor took half the class and said, hey, your grade is going to be totally based on weight of the pots that you create this semester. And here's the scale, and at the end of the semester, you're gonna come and put them on the scale, and that's how you get your grade. So the highest weight, they'll get an A, and kind of so on a kind of bell scale. They took the other half of the class and said, you're gonna be graded on solely your finest piece of pottery. And the first team, they went away. Day one, they had their hands on pots. They were creating 5, 6, 7 pots a day, and experimenting, trying weird and different things, getting feedback from the pots. The second group, on the other hand, they read a lot. They read about the philosophy of pots. They visited different galleries and things like that. And at the end, It's no surprise that the first team, or the first group of people, were the ones that created the finest pottery. Is the ones that were able to go through the cycle, go through the feedback loop, learn over and over again. And I think your business and your prototype is a lot like that, where you need to get used to being uncomfortable, get used to moving fast and testing things, rather than waiting for you to build the perfect product and really believe that if you build it, they will come. Because there's a lot of studies out there that show that's not really the case. So as we think about prototypes, what we want to talk about is how long and what's the time investment to create them, and what's the realness factor? How real does it feel to somebody that you're trying to sell to? How real does it feel to somebody you're having a conversation with? And so trying to get to real enough to test, and here you can see the realness to launch would be you're ready to deploy it, you're ready to sell it, commercialize it, that sort of thing. And so this is what's referred to by Jake Knapp as the Goldilocks zone, where we're trying to get just right. We're trying to not spend enough time or too much time waiting until we get feedback, and really try to prioritize that earlier than later. And so if we build a real product, you can see it takes us a while to get to that realness factor where we can have a conversation where somebody can go through, we can talk about the value prop, and it's really going to take a long time to learn. If we use functional prototypes, we can get to real enough to test, as Peter said, in weeks and days, not months. And so really it's about trying to learn and trying to figure out how do we suspend disbelief in people that this really exists. And it's not about lying, it's not about smoke and mirrors, it's about kind of helping them understand that this will be a thing in the future. And is this something you're looking for? Does this solve your problem? And you can test kind of willingness to pay and a few other factors based on this.
So I want to talk a little bit for our corporate folks. So there's something that is inherently going to be a challenge in the corporate world, which is, so I'll use my personal example. So when you start to really hit home on an idea that you can prototype, whether it's a mobile app or a web app or some other thing, like some other tool, if you have an effective means of prototyping, you can sometimes get that prototype done within 2 weeks. At least your first cut. First cut, I'm ready to show this to my manager, my boss, my peer. When you actually go and start like coding those things, start building, your authorization process of figuring out how you're going to create accounts is going to take 4 weeks. So if you think about it, as soon as you actually have a team on board and they're all ready for you to go, they're not even going to see an output from your developers that you have working on this for probably 4 weeks. Like you're not even going to be able to show it to them. It's going to be a bunch of code, right? And it can get frustrating for you. It's super frustrating when someone is shelling the cash out and has already seen it. So the one thing that's important is there are some tools, and we don't have any of them listed, but I can walk you through some of them. There are some tools that will literally, they are ugly. Like they prototype and they look ugly. And the reason that they do that is because it makes it easier for you to sell in your corporate that like you haven't figured it all out yet. It's not, oh yeah, we got to plug it in the back end. Like, don't say that. That's not true. It's going to be a challenge. So how the tools that you pick and the level of completeness that you need, that is going to be something that's an important balance. It also depends on what type of company you're in. So like B2B versus B2C. Sometimes a B2C is a little bit easier to have a fancier prototype and you can guide people through like user interviews. B2B, it can be tough because you get big companies in there. I'll say they're in the logistics industry and it's like, when can I start moving freight? I'm in. Like it's, boom, you get my lanes. Well, we're not ready. We haven't set up any sort of EDI connection or anything. Well, you mean you got to go through and then you got to answer all these questions about stuff you haven't figured out yet. So just be aware that this is a great boon. And as they said in the best Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility. So remember that one, because this is something that I would say in the corporate world, for me personally, I realized that the hard way. Like, yeah, we still have a long road and I just sold it to see if people wanted it. And now the worst thing happened. They said, do it. Right? It's the worst thing. So it's like, oh, it's the best and worst thing. So that was my main risk here for our corporate friends. They work through this, that sometimes being too real is too good. So we talked about our 3 types of prototypes: static, functional, and working. And so again, this isn't like textbook worthy. So I wouldn't want to get quoted on this on the textbook. Instead, I'll just get quoted on this being recorded and having it put on the internet. But what I will say is, when we look at this, we took a shot at how do you overlay these 2 areas that we're talking about today. which is your prototypes and your role as an early stage artist. And how do you evolve your role as an early stage artist while also evolving your prototype? I can tell you firsthand, the moment you build your prototype and you're really pleased with it, you never want to go back and touch it because, man, that was hard. And every time you go back, it's like, oh, I kind of sped up a little bit and I did this, in a really kind of dirty fashion, and now I got to go back and clean it up, and I'll just leave it there. Please evolve your prototype. It will pay dividends, right? And so as we think about this, a static versus functional versus working, Snapcat in its current form, which by the way is still, I think, a genius idea. If you use that, you could take Snapcat and maybe 2 or 3 key screens, if you will, that would be able to highlight what value Snapcat brings. You'll be able to identify if that's a specific and important enough problem. I'm afraid to hear the answer of whether Snapcat is viewed as a specific and important enough problem, but you will. You'll also be able to figure out the size of the market. And it won't do the research for you. You still have to do the research and figure it out. But if you were to come here and ask TitletownTech, I have this app, it's called Snapcat. Here's the problem that we're solving. Here's what we think the market size is. The first question we're going to ask is, so how did you get to that number? The number's wrong. The number's always wrong. Everybody's numbers are wrong. Like, look at Disney Plus just launched. The service fails. Why? Well, their numbers are wrong. Disney, right? What has Disney had a bad user experience? Don't answer the question because I'm on camera. So, it's one of those things where it's like, people get the numbers wrong. That's okay. But how did you get to that number? That tells me more about you as an early stage artist than it does about the market. And like I said, I'm betting on you. I'm betting on the market too, but I'm also betting on you. So those can get done on a static play. What gets harder is when you start trying to get into the real machinations of how this is going to work and what could your revenue be and all these different things. That gets harder when you only have a static prototype. So having something that people can get engrossed in really helps it because they turn off their I'm being sold hats, especially if they're people you trust. And if you can get people to take off their I'm being sold to hat, you tend to get pretty good feedback. And so that's where, from a functional standpoint, you can start really going through and finding out, okay, yep, they probably aren't going to pay $16.99 for Snapcats, but they might pay per cat picture. And so I'm going to put that in there where it's now buy this picture 99 cents and it gets sent to some picture company and prints out and sends to their house or whatever. So you can start doing those things with a functional prototype that you couldn't do with your static. And then finally, as I mentioned before, in the working prototype, we have a pretty, I would say, trying to find the right term here. Once you start getting into the available technical skills in the market of the people that are at the corporates or people you know about, who you've worked with in the past, for the most part, those skill sets are relatively the same based on the type of industry that we have here. And then you have pockets of unique capabilities that go on. And the challenge as an early stage artist is if you have pockets of unique capabilities, and those pockets tend to also be the pockets that you need because you're going to build in some certain language, that means money. And what you don't have at this stage is money, right? So you got to figure out, okay, what are my gaps in my talent? Because if you're going through and saying, oh yeah, I'm going to hire a developer at $60 an hour and they're going to come work for me, and it's like, all you have to do is quit your job and I can't guarantee you they're going to be here for 60 days. I don't know how many developers you know. There aren't a lot that will do that full time. They might do it part time, and what that means is you run out your timeline, and maybe you build half as fast instead of twice as fast. But you can start to have these discussions. You identify where your gaps come in. It becomes very real. And so as you move from your functional prototype and your working prototype, where tech actually matters, or in the case of a manufacturing world, where the materials actually matter, right? There's a great picture of a clay Tesla Model S and a real Tesla Model S, and the only thing that's the same are the wheels. The wheels are the same. Everything else changed, right? So figuring out what those gaps are is really, really valuable. And it's a great way to come forward and say, okay, you know what? I think I'm ready to come ask for money now. I think I'm ready. And whether that's at a corporate and you're asking for $1 million because you got to roll it out to all your stores, or whether it's a small Snapcat app that you want to try to take advantage of and just see, put it in the App Store or something, that's about where we like it. Up here, if you're still working through these things, framing up, testing the realistic unit economics, identifying potential customers. When it comes from my world, from the raising money world, there can be investment at this stage if you've gone through and identified a specific or important problem. So if you can articulate the value of that problem, you have you've increased the chances of getting investment. Doesn't mean it's a guaranteed yes, but if you've done better than most. And so that's a really important thing. If you're hearing that the problem isn't that important, what it means is the problem isn't that important to them. And so then if you really believe that the problem is that important, you need to start going other places. And if they're all saying no and everyone's saying no and you just really, really believe it, you either taking a flyer and you're going on your own, which, hey, there's plenty of examples of how that's worked, or you can maybe move to the next stage and bring in a functional example. And you can say, well, here's a little bit closer. Here's what I mean. Here's how it works. So this was just an attempt to say, hey, if I had to pick, how would I encourage and what brush would I encourage an early stage artist to use? And the brushes were static, functional, and working prototypes. That's about how I would be thinking about managing a portfolio of prototypes. When it comes to timing, timing's always important. I took Andrew's chart here, which I really like, and laid out the colors of the prototypes. So the static was the blue, the functional is the yellow, and then the actual working prototype is in the green. So as we think about days, weeks, and months, this is about the level of time that you should be thinking about investing in and making this better. So you should be able to go through and be defining your product requirements, identifying potential customers, setting milestones with a functional prototype. That should be a matter of weeks. Not 2 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks, but your prototype should be able to last about that long, maybe tweak it here and there. I would not expect your developers to be cutting their code as fast as you're cutting your prototype. There's just a wall of jello that you'll hit, and time dilation is gonna pop in, and it'll be disappointing at first because you're just expecting everything to move at your pace. But over time, it's gonna actually provide a lot of value to have a prototype that you can give to developers and they can come back and say, are you sure you want your app to go from this screen to that screen? I was wondering if maybe we could do this. Because now you get your developers to not just cut code, but also provide feedback. And now you have one other person who's on your side providing feedback, which is valuable. So we talked about the risks, so we can cut through this one. That was more on the be careful. And then the tools. So these are 4 tools that we've used. I've used 2. Andrew's used all of them. And so the websites are here. You can check them out. All of them are free. Is Marvel app free?
I think they do, yeah, POP. So it stands for prototyping on paper. And so actually that Snapcat example was from that, where you can actually sketch on paper, take photos of it, and actually link those screens together just like you would an application. So you can be able to go through that process and take someone through it. But yeah, all of them, I don't think Sketch has a free plan.
Okay.
They might have a student plan, but I think Sketch is like $99 a year. There's probably a free trial that you could try as well. But as far as tools that we choose, we used to use Sketch with InVision. At Headway, personally, we use Figma because it helps us go from low fidelity wireframes to high fidelity designs really quickly. And actually now integrating a lot of real-time smart animation. So if I go back to the example of the functional prototype with our new smart animations, you could see this looks like an app, it fades in. You can control how it slides in, fades in, whatever you like, and animates between those screens just like you would in code. So getting that in front of users really is convincing about, hey, this is gonna be a product or will be soon.
I would say from a skill level, if you've ever found yourself in PowerPoint using shapes in really weird ways at like 11:30 at night, you can use Figma. So Figma is what I moved to. I had an app called Balsamic, which is with a Q at the end. And that application is also a prototyping tool. It's one of the ones that it makes it look ugly on purpose, so you don't get too far, you don't promise too much inadvertently. I moved to Figma because I too found myself using PowerPoint in weird ways at 11:30. And I was really easy to start dragging out squares, drawing circles. It's a really easy way to add some of the the shading, depth. All of a sudden you're going from basic shapes into more complex stuff. And so it's a really relatively an easy tool to pick up and use. It's got a lot of depth, so you can go pretty far with it. It's free. And then the final one is you can invite people to collaborate with you. So I will say guilty for sending Andrew, probably way too many, hey, go log into this file, and then being like, hey, why did you never log into my file that I sent you? But yeah, but you can share and collaborate across teams, and it's a great way to guide people through. So all in all, all good tools. They're all trying to accomplish similar goals. So find what's right to you. For the most part, I think they all have pretty good communities.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what
Yeah, I think that's more standalone. So Marvel app is very similar to Envision app, where you can upload images, you can do the same. But I think they acquired prototyping on paper. I'm not sure when, but something you can use if you're just doing sketches, you don't want to get into it. Really good for B2C apps. You know, Snapchat's a good example. There's other apps. If you had an idea for a dating app, you could take photos and interview people on the street, go to the mall, go to bars, wherever is the right market for you, and be able to test that in a good way and have a conversation. And again, just another way that you can use a model or a tool to be able to drive that conversation forward.
So the final thing for me is just a couple of caveats before we get into the Q&A. Everything we showed was mobile here just for form factor. So it's not like these are mobile-only tools or anything like that. So feel free to dive in and explore them. And then the final one, the final thing is for our corporate friends, I don't think we have any sort of there's typically not any concerns with what WebSockets you're using or sharing things through. These apps don't necessarily have to worry about that kind of stuff. So sometimes it's good to get to your graphic design team and have them check it out first. And if they can get it, maybe you can get it. So it's all, I know sometimes where you go to get your software matters. So just be aware that, I'm not telling you to go on your corporate computer and download software and say, Peter at TitletownTech said it was okay. So don't tell them that yet.
Yeah, one kind of tangent of that is in Figma, they came out with plugins recently, and they have the ability to tie into Google Sheets. It really has an API. And so you can name your files certain values, pull those in. So we've used a lot with corporate teams or even teams that are trying to launch new revenue streams. Using real customer data from these sheets helps you to prototype really quick and helps you switch between. So you can have one master prototype that you then duplicate and customize with the Google Sheet data and be able to really go and, hey, this is actually going to be a new revenue stream that we're offering. Here's your real data, and be able to lower that barrier to create versus going, all the way full real prototype in code. You can do that right in Figma.
Okay, I think that's it. I think yeah, absolutely. Thank you and questions. Thank you and Q&A. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you.